I'm the hand of Gork and Mork. I'm the prophet of the Waaagh, and all worlds burn in my blueprints. We is gonna stomp the universe flat and kill anything that fights back. We is gonna do this cause we's orcs, and we was made to fight and win.
The story of Ghazghkull Thraka, the most remarkable orc the galaxy has ever seen, starts rather unremarkably. An unimportant Goff Boy on a boring backwater world, living as nothing more than an orc stereotype. That backwater planet in the Zornian system was named Orks, later called Ork by the Orks. Ork was, however, originally fairly significant to humanity. It was rich in minerals and mines, and hive cities sprouted up all over the planet. Until an Ork Waaagh showed up, that is. The green-skinned wildfire swept across Ork, raising its cities and population. Not to conquer or to subjugate, but just for the fun of fighting. After the Ork victory, they simply left to go find more fights. They did, however, unwittingly leave behind traces of their spores, which would one day, of course, grow into more orcs. Control over Ork would often change hands over the course of time. From Aldari outposts, Hrud warrens, Spinodorian clusters. But these races were persistently prodded by bands of orcs, sprouting up into various corners of the planet. Sometimes it's just easier to move than to scrub your home completely clean of fungus down to the microbial level. Until, of course, the Imperium of Man returned during the Great Crusade, and the Emperor's Dark Angel Space Marine Legion scoured the planet of all life and returned its ownership to mankind. 2 millennia passed before yet another Ork Waaagh came crashing into the Zornian system, like a green tsunami. The largest recorded orc attack upon the Imperium to date, and soon, Ork would yet again succumb to a horde of green. This time, though, the tides of the warp were shifting. Where once Ork and the Zornian system were easily accessible, it was now much more cut off. This would begin a long stagnation of orcs on Ork. For 8,000 years, it became a battleground for the ever-warring tribes. Warlords would rise and fall, never powerful enough to unite more than a few tribes to his banners, until he too was snuffed out by the next in line. This vicious, futile, and orky cycle would continue on and on and on, until Ghazghkull Thraka was born. Amidst the blinding white of a vicious blizzard, a speck of green emerged as the hand of a newborn orc pulled himself up from his grow hole. This green, not yet Ghazghkull speck trudged its way to a nearby Goff fort called Gogduff, wherein he became a part of the very cycle that stagnated among the orcs of Ork. This newcomer became a trooper at Gogduff and joined its mobs for raids, and fought and grew and fought and grew, just as all orcs had and all orcs would do. The day would come when the Gogduff clan would raid a nearby abandoned Dark Angel's outpost left behind millennia ago. This would come from Ghazghkull's challenge of the clan's chief, wondering why he had let the base stand unopposed to spy on the orcs for so long. As it turns out, challenging an orc with a fight is a great way to get an orc to engage in said fight. So Ghazghkull, the chief, and the Goff boys set off to raze and plunder the old fort. Unfortunately for the orcs, though the fort was abandoned of personnel, it was not lacking in automated defenses. Though the orcs would emerge victorious in hacking apart the old machines and turrets, It is said that 8 mini orcs went up the mountain, and only mini and 4 were still standing when the last turret was ripped from its mounting. Ghazghkull would not be a part of the mini and 4 when the battle was over. In the initial rush towards the structure, a bolter shell from the first turret tore through Ghazghkull's skull, removing a good portion of it, along with turning another good portion of his brains into mush. When the battle was over, there were 2 different accounts of what happened to Ghazghkull. While these accounts are conflicting, they are also each known to be completely accurate. And if that doesn't make sense to you, it's simply because you're not orky enough. The first account says that after the battle's end, Ghazghkull was lying about the battlefield, bleeding out and missing a good chunk of his brains. So, his own mob helped drag him away and drove him across the Badlands to a Deathskull's outpost, where they heard that a messed up pain boy was paying well for orcs with grievous wounds. Ghazghkull was placed on Mad Doc Grotsnick's slab, and his comrades were paid either 3 teeth and a new chopper, or a handful of bullets. The second account says that the mortally wounded Ghazghkull was left behind by his mob, but instead of lying down and dying, he found the strength to live. But this was only because he was to go on to become Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka. He pulled himself to his feet, using both of his hands to hold his own brains in, and set off to find someone who could help him. He then, brains in hand, traveled across 200 miles of Badlands, stopping to fight no less than 3 vicious beasts on the way, until he came upon a Deathskull's outpost called Rust Spike, where there, Mad Doc Grotsnick could well put him back together. The only part of the story that matters is that Ghazghkull wound up on Grotsnick's table, a table on which most orc boys and warbosses alike lasted less than an hour before drifting into the wrong side of kill or cure. Ghazghkull should have died many times on that table, but he simply didn't fancy it. Grotsnick himself was quite happy with Ghazghkull's refusal to die, as he didn't normally get to operate and tinker on a patient long enough to have any fun. Grotsnick replaced the missing portion of Ghazghkull's skull with a piece of heavy-gauge ceramite plasteel he had taken off some Terminator armor, but not before stapling what was left of his brain to some bits of ripe scrap that Grotsnick kept in a bucket nearby. But the operation didn't stop there. Grotsnick replaced Ghazghkull's missing eye with a bionic one, and even replaced one of his knees with a bionic joint. Not that Ghazghkull needed the new knee at all, just that Grotsnick had been wanting to try this new pioneering knee replacement for ages. But as it turns out, through the varying operations and the constant amount of blood loss, by the time Grotsnick was done, Ghazghkull was dead. Now, when an orc died on Grotsnick's slab, it was taken out behind the tent and added to the failures pile, where a particular grot's job was to pry out any bionics and return them to the dock. The grot used its getting stick to poke and prod the orc and ensure it was dead. Once satisfied, the grot jumped onto Ghazghkull's chest to begin prying the metal slab covering the newly stitched back-together brains. But as soon as the stick touched the metal, the orc shot up, convulsing in some sort of seizure. When the seizing stopped, Ghazghkull sat, mouth open, not in pain or confusion, but in awe, like he'd seen something the orcs can only describe as mega. He grabbed the nearby grot by the shoulder and let the tiny thing peer into his eye as it gleamed a bright green, which became the entire universe. And he shared the vision he had just had with this grot. It was a vision sent by Gork and Mork themselves. A holy vision that showed oceans of green-skinned tribes all rallied under a single banner, completely unheard of in Ork society. And this vast Waaagh branched out into the galaxy, conquering world after world until the whole of the universe itself was infinite green. And just like that, the vision was over, and Ghazghkull said his first words to the insignificant grot. Words which would never be outdone in summing up Ghazghkull.
Now listen close or I'll batter you. Some orcs are clever. Some orcs are strong. I'm both.
He then commanded the grot to write down everything they'd seen in the vision, lest they forget. Using the piece of scrap metal that constituted as the grot's home, and Ghazghkull's own blood as the ink, the grot went to work. But orcs don't really have a written language, but words and drawings are essentially the same thing in orc culture. So the grot painted the image of the grand vision. A massive and perfect orc, with horns and all the arms holding guns, standing on a big pile of bodies, with spaceships going round its head. Ghazghkull took this sheet of metal and attached it to the grot's getting stick, and using a bit of blood between his brain stitches, anointed the image on the banner and gave the grot a name, Makari. Now, grots don't usually get names beyond Git or Hey You. This made Makari unique, and he'd forge a special bond with Ghazghkull over the years. But having the name was most important, because grots die. Kind of a lot. But with how orcs work in general, anytime Makari would die, Ghazghkull could just find another grot and tell them that they're Makari, and boom, they'd then be Makari. And not in like a go get a new goldfish for your kid and name it the same as the last one to cover up its death kind of way, but in a literal orky kind of way, where this new grot was actually Makari. Memories, personality, and all. After Ghazghkull's revival, he went and did what any orc, both strong and cunning, would do. He found the biggest warboss on Ork, a death skull named Dregmek, and crumped him real good. Be it the size disparity between Ghazghkull and Dregmek, or the fact that none of Dregmek's bullets could strike Ghazghkull calmly walking into the fight, a large crowd had gathered around in the streets to witness this fight.
You're an offense to the gods. You find other orcs squabbling over human scrap like a snotling. You're the sort of orc, and Gork and Mork know it. I am the warlord of warlords, and the prophet of Gork and Mork. They speak through my tusks, and my fists, and my head. I am Ghazghkull, and I will bring great slaughter.
With a mighty headbutt from his newly replaced cranium, Ghazghkull brought Rustspike under his banner and turned his gaze to the rest of Ork. It took him 6 years to subjugate the rest of the planet, but this was only the start to his growing legend. For the first time, all of Ork was working together. All the warbosses strategizing. All the mech boys tinkering and collaborating together. They cobbled together new fortresses and weapons, built massive engines of destruction, and a fleet of aircraft to carry them from the planet. The truth of Ork was that its sun was dying, and as the orcs began to notice the sudden dimness of their sun, their superstitions came to the forefront. But Ghazghkull told them that it was a sign from Gork and Mork, and they were telling the orcs it was time for the galaxy to feel the power of their surmounting Waaagh. And, as if to accentuate his point, the sky was filled with green lightning as he spoke. erasing any doubts that he spoke for the greenskin gods. The Orks of Urk prepared for their departure, though they were still not sure how it was to be so, for they had no spacecraft capable of traversing the galaxy. But when they would awake one morning and find their planet bathed in shadow, it was not because their sun had finally died out, but rather because a massive space hulk had deposited itself from the warp and into their planet's orbit. Another gift from the gods. Ghazghkull was quick to command his mechs to secure the space hulk with tractor beams, and began the exodus of the billions of greenskins on Urk. While the space hulk arriving above Urk just in time to ferry the Orks away from their dying star was a gift from Gork and Mork, it certainly wasn't a gift given for free. As it so happens, the space hulk was infested with countless demonic hordes. But for Ghazghkull and the Orks, who had spent years as a united front and hadn't had a good fight since then, the idea of fighting an endless wave of enemies was more a gift from the gods than the spacecraft itself. And so, for 3 weeks straight, the Ork ships went back and forth from the space hulk to Urk, airlifting more Orks into the endless onslaught of demons, until at last they battled their way into the hulk's city-sized engine room, where they found an enormous warp rift. The Orks opened fire on the rift in hopes of closing it, but that didn't work. Ghazghkull then called for his mech-built artillery squad to hammer the rift. They did so for an hour. That didn't work either. He then reckoned that he'd have to just close the rift himself, but on his approach, a great hulking brute of a demon stepped through the rift. Gork and Mork can be generous gods. It was a bloodthirster, to be precise, a greater demon of Khorne. The crowd of Orks watched as Ghazghkull ran faster than he ought to be able to in all his armor. Every Ork knows that you can't move fast in armor. That's the trade-off. It's either one or the other. But Ghazghkull didn't do trade-off, and was sprinting as fast as an Ork could towards the demon with glee. In the blink of an eye, Ghazghkull had barreled the demon onto its back, then, standing on his chest, proceeded to club it to death with his fist. Then, much like what he did with Rust Spike, he brought the space hulk, now called World Killer, under his control with a mighty headbutt, which closed the rift. Headbutts are oddly spiritual to the Orks. The idea of hitting something with the thing that you think with is using the gifts of both Gork and Mork, like a speech or sermon, because a speech is just another way of hitting someone with your mind. With the World Killer under their control, the Orks set off into the galaxy through the warp, guided by fate, Ghazghkull, and the will of their gods. It's unknown how long the Orks drifted through the warp, as time passes strangely in the Sea of Souls, and the Orks don't keep records, so. Either way, World Killer would drop back into real space in a perfect attack position over the Imperial world called Armageddon. Now, the wars for Armageddon are incredibly detailed and lore-rich events, which would take their own much longer videos to cover all the specifics with. For now, I'll just touch on the highlights relevant to Ghazghkull's story. On that subject, it's important to note that Ghazghkull frequently had splitting headaches that would turn into seizures, like what had happened when he had his first vision. These ongoing ones were considered to be more visions, but as time would go on, they seemingly began getting worse, which could be attributed to the constant surgeries Mad Dog Grotznick insisted on doing to help relieve the headaches, but really the Pain Boy just liked to tinker with what he considered was his greatest creation. With the World Killer's sudden appearance over Armageddon, the Imperium of Man was anything but prepared for the violence that awaited them. But Armageddon was an industrial juggernaut, a vital node of navigational channels and myriad manufactorums essential for supplying the armies of the Imperium, and thus, mankind would not surrender the planet willingly. Up to this point, Ghazghkull had only made his name known on Ork, but he was about to become known over the entire Imperium as the Beast of Armageddon. Unpersuaded by salvos rendered from Armageddon's orbital defenses, World Killer flew directly into the surface of Armageddon Prime, kickstarting the Ork invasion. Now, in my opinion, flying a git-crumping entire space hulk into a bloody planet is the most orky an Ork invasion can get. The surprise and shock of this, along with many millions of greenskins charging into their armies, left Ghazghkull in an initial winning position. He took Hive City after Hive City and made a mockery of the defenses meant to oppose him and his greenskin horde. But that was all until Hive Hades. At Hive Hades, Ghazghkull was introduced to Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, a man who would go on to become his Grodd, which is the Ork word for favorite enemy. You could even almost say it's an Ork's version of a schoolyard crush, but I digress. Ghazghkull became obsessed with trying to defeat this new adversary and conquer Hive Hades, that his focus was nowhere else. He split more of his army and warbosses off to fight other Hive cities, but this would come to its eventual conclusion at the city of Acheron, when the Emperor's angels descended upon the planet and set themselves upon the Greenskin Tide. Through the combined arms of Blood Angels, Salamanders, and Ultramarines, the Orks knew their first taste of crushing defeat. If Ghazghkull had, in that moment, averted his obsessed eyes from Hive Hades and rallied his forces against the Space Marines, he could have continued on the path of victory. Alas, he did not, and so the arrival of the Space Marines would mark the beginning of the end for Ghazghkull's first trip to Armageddon. Ghazghkull's headaches kept getting worse, and bashing his head against the wall that was Commissar Yarrick didn't do them any favors. He felt like the gods had gone silent, and it was sending him into a spiral.
I ain't sure the gods believe in me anymore. We're only gonna keep winning if the boys believe we are. The boys will only believe that if the bosses believe it. And the bosses will only believe that if I believe it. But I ain't sure I believe it. And I ain't sure because I ain't sure the gods believe in me. They've stopped talking to me. I still get the headaches, but there's no green in them. Just darkness. And I don't know if it's because I should know how to win without them telling me, or if it's because they found some other orc who's more worth talking to somewhere else. Either way, I've let them down. I don't feel like the rest of them, like the bosses. It started on Ork, but it's worse now. That lot, they live to fight. It gives them everything they need, like it should be. And I'll act like I'm the same. I'll beat them at arm wrestling. I'll bet on squig fights. I'll drink until they are sick. But I'm pretending. I've lost my rock raza, my battle bliss. I need more. I need something else. But I don't know what it is.
With his defeat on Armageddon inevitable, Ghazghkull planned a last collaborative assault against Hive Tartarus with the remainder of all his forces. But this was just so that he and the clan bosses could sawed off in a spaceship while the humans were distracted. Ghazghkull continued to feign being normal to what remained of his Waaagh, but things were getting worse between the headaches and the self-doubt he was feeling. The Mad Dog Grotsnik was still constantly tinkering on him. The clan bosses continuously urged him to return to Armageddon, and he couldn't hear the voices of the gods he was to be prophet of any longer. Surprisingly enough, it was none other than his grot sidekick Makari who told him that the only one not believing in Ghazghkull was Ghazghkull.
Yeah, you're right. It's clear, isn't it? I must have stopped believing in myself. Or you started believing a bit too much in yourself, Makari. Either way, as you like to say, if a lowly, stick-thin little streak of awful like you reckons it can tell me what to do, something has gone wrong. It's useful, though, you talking to me like this. You've reminded me that a real orc doesn't take counsel from grots. A real orc, Makari, and I'm as real as it gets, doesn't even take counsel from the gods, or from anyone but himself. You were a mistake. A weakness that I thought was a strength. But from now on, there will be no more mistakes. There will be only strength. You tell Gork and Mork I'll be alright without them.
And with a thumb and forefinger around Makari's head, Ghazghkull sent him into the Great Green, until such a time that he would decide to bring him back. For the time being, though, Ghazghkull had his swagger back. Now he just needed a new army for his Waaagh. He'd spend the next decades rebuilding this army bigger and better than ever before. Whether it was from unifying orc planets like Golgotha as he did with Urk, or being sought out by many other orc warbands as Ghazghkull's name had gone on in legend in orc society. Waaagh Ghazghkull, the greatest and largest Waaagh in history, was ready to set out and turn the galaxy green once and for all. And it would start where it inevitably had to be torn down and rebuilt, on Armageddon. The Greenskin Horde descended once again upon Armageddon, where an even more prepared Imperium was waiting. The bloodshed would be legendary. It was here on Armageddon that Ghazghkull had actually revived Makari a handful of more times, though not for his own purpose, but for those of his clan bosses constantly wanting the lucky, banner-waving grot around for good luck. But given the slight Makari felt from Ghazghkull killing him, despite it being the Ork way, he was having none of it. And even if he was to have it, it's not ungodly for a grot to constantly try to escape from his Ork master, since it means the Ork has to prove their power by stopping them. So Makari continued to find ways to get killed, be it by walking into oncoming enemy fire, or even at one point bashing his own head in with a wrench. But there was one time when Ghazghkull brought Makari back when it was just the two of them, deep within a jungle on Armageddon. The prophet began to speak, and so the grot listened. For perhaps the first time in his life, or even the first time for an orc, Ghazghkull was vulnerable and open with Makari. He apologized without actually apologizing, but in a way that was as close as an orc could actually get to it. He says that what he's created here is holy, the uniting of such large numbers of orcs, the massive Waaagh brought back to Armageddon. He admits he realized the gods never actually stopped talking to him, that they are the constant headaches he gets. It's them kicking him in the head, trying to get him to pay attention. He tells Makari that the two of them are leaving Armageddon, because Armageddon is as good as it gets, but it has to be happening all over the galaxy. That's what the gods have been trying to get him to understand. It was then that a damaged Imperial tank rolled into the jungle clearing where Ghazghkull and Makari were speaking. And before they could recognize the threat, a warhead exploded in Ghazghkull's abdomen. It wasn't enough to kill him, it was just a tank shell after all, but it had him properly on his back and a bit out of it. Before the tank could reload and finish the job, Makari crawled in through a grot-sized hole in the tank and murdered the crew. A minute later, he was standing over a dizzy but recovering Ghazghkull, reassuring his boss that he'd taken care of the problem.
All right. You've made your point. I'll say it, Makari. You were right. The gods want me to unite the Orks. There. Now, let's go turn the stars green.
It was then that Ghazghkull's mysterious disappearance from Armageddon was enacted, leaving his trusted warbosses in the continued siege of the Imperial planet. The timing of Ghazghkull's exit from Armageddon and the emergence of the Great Rift, or rather, Gork's Grin if you're an Ork, were not so far apart from each other that the Orks aren't convinced this warp rift occurred from Gork and Mork plucking Ghazghkull from Armageddon and hurling him across the galaxy to continue his work. In the subsequent Era Indomitus, Ghazghkull, the beast of Armageddon, has been spotted throughout Imperial space, sometimes in locations many light years apart with impossible speed, waging his great Waaagh and uniting more and more greenskins to his banner with every passing fight. But this, however, wouldn't be without speed bumps, despite Ghazghkull being a prophet and all. It was during the Battle of Krongar against the 6th Legion of Space Marines, the Space Wolves, that Ghazghkull lost his duel against the Wolf Lord Ragnar Blackmane and was ultimately beheaded. With his head detached from his body, Ghazghkull began to drift into the Great Green, and his vision began to darken with the finality of death. But within the Great Green, he heard the voices of Gork and Mork speak directly to him. No vision, no riddle.
You are the warlord of Warboss. You are a prophet. We speak through your tusks, and your fists, and your head. You are Ghazghkull, man Ork Thraka, and worlds burn in your blueprints.
His gaze then became visions of the infighting to come from his clan bosses vying for power and control now that he was gone. This angered the prophet. He'd spent his whole life bashing these orcs' heads together to get them to see they should be fighting in one direction together and not against each other. Gork and Mork urged him to recognize who it was he could trust and who had always done right by him. His vision shifted from clan boss to clan boss until but a sliver of light remained, and that little sliver shone on the Grot Makari. Meanwhile, Makari himself was also in the Great Green, again, having died being buried beneath a ton of rubble as he watched his boss's head get lopped from its body. One of the more loyal clan bosses, an orc named Bullets, was trying to bring Makari back the same way Ghazghkull had always been able to, in hopes that Makari would know what to do about Ghazghkull's death, as he'd always been the closest to the boss. Bullets stood next to a pile of dead grots, grabbing new ones from the line, asking them if they were Makari, and when they weren't, used his chopper to add them to the dead grot pile. But suddenly, Makari found himself in the audience of what was happening, when Mad Doc Grotsnick had used Ghazghkull's own severed hand to bring him back. When Makari reveals himself, and Bullets is asking him what they should do for Ghazghkull, Grotsnick interrupts and tells them that the boss is dead, but that he has an experimental idea that may remedy that situation and needs Makari's help. In Grotsnick's lab, it's revealed that he had been spending years building what would be called a mighty new super orc body, upon which he had recapitated Ghazghkull upon. The doc tells Makari that the two of them were both chosen by the gods to do what they do for Ghazghkull, two very spiteful sides of the same malicious coin, but that they needed each other now, and Ghazghkull needed them both. He says he knows this because them both being there for Ghazghkull is what the gods want, and because it's what the gods want is the only reason why this experiment will work and bring Ghazghkull back to super life. And it's the only reason they, and any orc even remotely close to the entire sector of space they were in, would survive when this experiment didn't explode in their faces, despite the tremendous odds against it working. Just normal orc stuff, really. Grotsnick had connected huge power generators in both real space and in the warp to send an electric blast powerful enough into the prophet's new body and resurrect him. And it just so happened to work. And so it is that now Ghazghkull returns to himself and to his great Waaagh, bigger, badder, and more terrifying than ever. With a body more akin of an entire Gorkanaut than a Warboss, and with dual weapons to match. Gork's claw is so massive that its blades can encompass and slice to bits an entire fully armored Primaris Space Marine. And Mork's roar, a custom shooter that produces so much Daka that his enemies don't so much as die, than they do simply evaporate into a red mist. Ghazghkull, the prophet of the Waaagh, is now the living embodiment of Gork and Mork, walking across the galaxy, turning star after star green at the head of the greatest and ever-growing and expanding Ork Waaagh ever seen. Ghazghkull Thraka is coming for the entirety of the galaxy, and with each passing day, more and more within and without the Imperium begin to fear that it's a fight he might just well win.